And so I battled for many years with the truth of my life. I always tell people I never even had to leave the house without facing the onslaught of abortion, because all I had to do was turn on the radio, turn on the TV, open the newspaper, and I would hear people talking about children like me like it's just a life that you can just throw away. When people say things like, who would take care of those children anyway? They're never going to amount to anything. They'll just be a drain on society. That's somebody's child we're talking about. That's somebody's brother, somebody's sister, somebody's friend. I don't take words like that lightly. And so it was a difficult journey for me. And I knew what I was being called to do. From the moment that I found out the truth about my life, I knew that someday I was going to have to come forward and share this publicly with the world. And I was scared to death. Because as we know, we live in a culture that doesn't want to talk about abortion, and then certainly doesn't talk about children like me who survive, at least not in positive terms. And so it took me many years to get to the point where I knew I could find the strength to come forward. And when I was 19, I started to do a couple of things in preparation, still kind of resisting what I knew I was being called to do, but stepping a little bit more closely to it. When I was 19, I started to look for my biological family, and I started working to obtain my medical records. Because even though I live in this skin and I know what happened to me, I've met, a whole lot of people who know exactly what happened to me. I knew that it's hard for people to believe lives like mine because we don't see many lives like mine. So I knew I had to have those medical records. And so I started looking for them. What people sometimes don't understand is why I went looking for my biological family. What people typically say to me is, why would you go looking for the people that tried to end your life? And my answer is very simple. I owe it to them. And I owed it to myself to try to find them, because I first of all wanted them to know that I love them, that I knew the truth, that I forgave them so long ago for that decision. I can't even tell you when it was that I first forgave them, but I forgive them every single day of my life, over and over again. So I wanted them to hear it from me, that I'm alive and well, and that I love them. And so I had to look for them before I came forward. That was important to me. And it took me 10 years to find my biological family and 10 years to finally obtain my medical records. And I tried everything in those 10 years to make those things happen. And certainly I have strong enough faith to know that it wasn't about my plans or my time. It was about, in God's time, how everything would unfold. And so in 2007, after years and years and tries, I finally obtained my medical records. And I keep copies of my medical records on my website because I want people to readily see the truth about abortion and about my life. And the piece on my medical records that you can see on my website is what I obtained in 2007 with some other pieces. And that one piece that so defines my life says, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. My life had to result from something being unsuccessful. But I know that's not God's plan. That's not God's plan for my life or anyone else's life. And that's why I fight so hard in the world today, because I want people to understand that every life is a success. Regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the situation, every single life is a success. And it's not our decision to judge or to decide whose life is worth saving. And so 2007 is when I obtained those medical records. And through those medical records, I found my biological family. They actually forgot to black out my birth parents' names in my medical records. I guess we call that a HIPAA violation in today's world, forgetting to black out something so personal. But I always call that, God's intervention, because that was his way of letting me finally find my biological parents. And so very quickly, when I found out who my birth parents were, I learned through my searching that I was living in the same city as my own biological father. I didn't grow up in that city. I always knew that city, Sioux City, Iowa, was the city where my mother's abortion had taken place. What I never could have guessed is that my own family was living right there in that same city, all those years later. And so after finding out that my father was there, I decided to contact him. And I sent him a letter back in July of 2007, just letting him know that I knew the truth about the abortion, that I love him and I forgave him. And I let him know, what a blessed life I've been given. I have an amazing adoptive family who has made me the person that I am today. But I let him know through that letter that if he ever wanted to have any kind of relationship with me, I'd be waiting to hear from him. And it's been over 5 years since I sent him that letter with no response. And that was really hard at first. Even though I had spent 10 years preparing for that, to have it happen that there would be no response was incredibly difficult. But I didn't carry the pain of that with me, and I set my sights after that on my mother's side of the family. Sadly, I've never been able to find my biological mother, because after the abortion took place, my parents' relationship ended and my mother married someone else. And so I've never been able to find her. But I did know who her parents were through my searching and certainly, of course, finding out who my mother was. And so I contacted my maternal grandparents back in 2007 also, just telling them everything I had said in my father's letter and asking them if they would pass along the message of love and forgiveness that I had to my biological mother. And since I never had heard back from my birth father, I never expected to hear anything back from my mother's parents. But I did. Within just 3 days, my grandfather responded back to me with a letter and some pictures. And in the letter, he admitted to the abortion taking place years ago. I think his exact words were, he knew, I knew, my live birth was not the intention at the hospital that day. Which, for him to even say that much was a very courageous thing indeed. In that letter, he told me a few things about my birth family. I found out my parents dated for 4 years before they became pregnant with me. And, it saddens me that after the abortion took place, my parents' relationship ended. I can only speculate, but I see it in families still today that an abortion changes everything. So many young women that I meet have been told that if they have an abortion, that their boyfriend or their husband will stay with them. But what they always tell me later is, I had that abortion and he left me. And so I can only gather that abortion had a very strong impact in my parents' relationship and, ultimately ended my parents' relationship. In my grandfather's letter, he let me know that my mother had never told anyone about the abortion and about me. And I can't fault her for that. I can't imagine how difficult her life has been. And how difficult it is for anyone in a society that doesn't want to talk about abortion or about having a painful consequence physically, emotionally, spiritually from an abortion, and then to talk about having a child that lived. I can't imagine how difficult it's been. And sadly, in his letter, he let me know that they wouldn't be passing along my message of forgiveness because in recent years, they had become estranged from my mother. And again, I can only speculate based on what I've gathered from my family and my own experiences and the work that I do, but it makes sense to me that my mother's abortion has changed even their relationship. Because what I've been able to gather is that it was most likely her parents, my grandparents, who made that decision for the abortion to take place. And so it makes great sense to me that their relationship is now strained. And so 2007 is the last time I heard from my mother's side of the family. And I'm at peace with that after all of those years of searching, because I have faith enough to know that if God intends for me to ever meet my biological mother or know my family, that it's going to happen in His way and His time. And 2007 is the first time I came forward with my story publicly as a survivor also. You know, after I first found out at the age of 14, I was pretty vocal about it. You know, I did things in speech contest, and I certainly gave speeches in my own classes at high school. But I grew to be very careful about speaking about it. When I went away to a university, I was very clearly communicated to that people didn't want to hear about what happened to me. And I had people who I thought were my friends that would say things to me like, "Oh, you know, Melissa, I'm so sorry that that happened to you, but it doesn't mean you have to be pro-life." And so it was a very long time before I spoke publicly again about it. And in 2007, after finally obtaining those medical records and trying to make contact with my biological family, is when I came forward publicly. And I first spoke with a group called Feminists for Life of America out of Washington, D.C. And I joined with Feminists for Life because I am a feminist who is pro-life. And I know that the first feminists were pro-life. And so it's important to me to join that cause and to help people understand that being pro-woman is also being pro-life. You know, to me, it's not an either-or situation, either the woman or the child. For me, it's a both and, for both women and their children. And so the first time I shared my story was on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. in 2007, which I can't believe now looking back on it, that I went out there and shared my story there for the first time, because that's a pretty big venue straight out of the gate. But I was out there, and of course, even though I knew what a blessing it is to be alive and have the opportunity to give a voice to my brothers and sisters who don't have a voice, you know, I was out there thinking, I am sick to my stomach. I'm a bundle of nerves. I just don't ever think I can do this again. When I went back home from there, what I found out was that I didn't have a bad case of nerves. I actually had a bad case of morning sickness with our daughter, Olivia, who's now 4 years old. But I was just a few days pregnant with her that first time I had shared my story out there on Capitol Hill. And I truly believe that that was God's message to me, that I was doing exactly what He had saved my life for. And as I was doing that, He would allow me to just see the amazing blessings He was continuing to give me in my life. And it was during my pregnancy with Olivia that I started to get more involved in pro-life work. You know, I have a master's degree in social work. I've worked in the fields of domestic violence, sexual assault counseling, mental health, substance abuse. You know, that was my background before I came forward publicly with my story. And I navigated both worlds for a while. But it was during my pregnancy with Olivia that I started to get more involved in pro-life work and spoke mainly on college campuses at that time, not just sharing my story, but really advocating for institutions to take a look at themselves and see what obstacles exist to people choosing life and being pro-family. And what I didn't know is that as I was advocating for people to choose life, my biological father was back home in Iowa fighting for his life. That's why I never heard from my father after I sent him that letter in 2007. Because about 6 months after I sent him that letter in January of 2008, my father lost his life. He was 51 at the time.